Hello, and welcome to the ADVizE mini lecture about organizing data. I'm Kristen Hunter Thompson. So before we jump in to thinking about what does this even mean, how are we going to organize our data, let's do a little reflection about how organizing data has gone in the past. So a couple questions for you. Once I read through them, or you can pause the recording now, pause and spend a few minutes, seconds thinking about this. It's always helpful to think about kind of where have we come from. So what are yellow lights with organizing data? So by that, I mean, what are things that have slowed you down in the past? What are questions you have about how or why we should even organize data? And then what are some red lights with organizing data? What in the past has just absolutely stopped you in your tracks when you try to organize or graph your data that you have? Okay. Yellow lights, red lights. What are some of those for you? So Nathan Yao is a very well-known data visualizer. His entire job is to visualize data, to look at data, to make sense of data, to make meaning of it, and then to share that out with others so that they can use it and understand. And Nathan says, I spend just as much time getting data in the format that I need as I do putting the visual part of the graphic together. Whew. Organizing data is a really important component of working with and making sense of data. And it's a piece that we don't actually spend a lot of time talking about or working on in the K-12 space. So let's think about this. Before we jump in, I just want to say, oftentimes we like to look at data like this, where it's like a full number of counts where we've like across all the Star Wars movies, there are 6 Star Wars movies and the maximum critic review is 8.7. But really, when we're exploring data and when we're visualizing data, when we're trying to make sense of it, we want what is called normalized data, meaning we want all the data so that we can look at it, make graphs from it, visualizations from it, and make meaning of it. It is hard. We are pretty limited on what we can do, what questions we can ask, how we can explore these data. But oh wow, we can do a lot with this. Now, if this orientation looks a little funny, don't worry, hang with me. We're going to talk about this a little bit more. So let's think about our data tables. Oftentimes, we set up our data tables in some way like this. Okay, yeah, the actual words in here might not be relevant, but this orientation of data, you can imagine sort of doing tick marks in each of this row for your number of individuals, and then you can imagine doing some calculations to figure out which of those individuals as a percentage of the class to calculate and put in down in the table down here. This organization might feel really similar to things that you've seen on like worksheets your teachers ask you to do, or things that might be showing up in some example lesson plans that you might be using going forward or that you already have used in your student teaching. This is really good for data collection, this organization. And once we have collected the data, made sense of it, understand like what we want to say from it, that is really good for sharing out after we've done that interpretation. But here's the thing. This is not a very good way to actually explore the data to make meaning from it. So it's this in-between thing. So this is our bookend. Data tables provide really great for our bookend. And specifically when data tables are set up in this wide organization format. So this is jargony words, we call it wide in this format, where our variables are spread out across columns. So here the variable that we're looking at is year. And there are different years that we have information, 1952, 1962, 72, and 82. So that one variable of year is actually spread out across multiple columns. And so, and then often down our like left-hand side is one variable that we're really interested in. Here it's country. And then a third variable is embedded within the cell. So here it's life expectancy. And you would not know that unless I told you. Though, to be honest, it usually does show up kind of in the title of the table, but that requires reading the title. And let's be honest, all humans are not necessarily very good at reading titles, especially our learners. But here, life expectancy for 1952 in Afghanistan was 29 years. This is another thing, like, I need to tell you that it's years because it's not written in the cell, or maybe it would have been in the title. But this is really helpful to get this relational nature of, okay, so what about 1972 for Algeria? It was 55. So, but there's this sort of tricky thing with units and getting our graphing programs to graph the data because they don't really like it when letters show up. Yeah, but we'll get to that in a second. But when it comes to setting up our data tables, make sure some tips for how to do this in a really useful way, because data tables, remember, are really important for data collection and for after we know what's going on in the data to sharing that out. So make sure your variables are really well named, ideally with units, but not in the cell. So either in that title or the column header or the row headers. Label the purpose of the columns so that we know 1952, 62, 72, 82, that those are actually years. It's not 1952. Label the purpose of the rows. So we have that with the country as the column header and really get you a sense, to give you a sense of, okay, so each row is a country in that data table that I just showed you. And if there were any summary statistics, so there weren't in that the life expectancy by year and country that I just showed you, but the previous one with liberal, moderate, and conservatives, I believe, the percentage of class, that's a summary statistic. So it can be really helpful to make that pop for your reader. So putting it in bold, or make sure you've got, like, it's really good, we've got percentage written there, and you'd want to do the percent sign within each of those cells. And include a descriptive caption that makes it easier for the reader to scan the data and get a sense of what's going on. Help your reader out. Tell them what you are showing them in the data table. Can be really helpful. So again, our data tables, really good for data collection, really good for once we already know what we want to say from the data, to share out kind of in a concise way summary of our data. But they're not often the best way to organize our data, to explore it and make meaning of it and make graphs from it. That is where our databases come in. And we often use things like Google Sheets or Excel as the program for our databases. Now, let me be honest, we can also make data tables in Google Sheets and Excel as well. That's just a tool. It's just a tool, a platform that we use. But what we're looking for is a way to help us with this exploratory data analysis. If that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry, we'll get to that in the next mini lecture. But basically think about that as like you're exploring and you're trying to make meaning from the data. You're trying to figure out what you want to say from the data and making some graphs as you explore. This is where we want to use our long organization of data. So when we're talking about data tables, they're often set up in a wide organization. When we want to be leveraging our databases or our graphing programs, we want to set our data up in a long organization. So what's a long organization? Well, it's really long. It doesn't even all fit on this page. But each variable here has its own column. So now country had a column back in our wide organization, but remember, year was across all those columns. Here, year is just in one column, and life expectancy is now in its own column, and we can put those units up in the column header for life expectancy. So it's now been pulled out. It's really clear right from the start, looking across the column headers, what is going on in the long organization. What you will notice, though, is that because we now have a column for each, like there's a column for year and life expectancy, that means we have 4 rows for Afghanistan, because we have 4 different measurements of the life expectancy in Afghanistan across each of those 4 years. So our rows have now become each observation. So when we're thinking about our data to graph it, we're really leveraging our database organization or our long organization. There's a row for every observation. So no sets of observations are kind of like grouped, subgrouped relationally in the columns. Every cell has a value. Every cell has a value. So we don't want to merge any rows. We want Afghanistan to show up 4 times, even though it is repetitive, because that helps the program, that helps when we're getting our graphing programs to graph the data. That's what they're looking for. They don't want it merged. And every variable has its own column, as we've talked about, no embedding of the variables. So we've got our variables or our attributes, we have our observations, and then each cell has a value for each of those observations and each variable or attribute. So we need to think about, like, there's the initial how we collect data, how we're writing it down, how we're writing it, and then how we put it into our database programs, which like Google and many like Google Sheets can function also as our graphing programs, though we'll explore that a little bit more. So we think about, we don't want to merge Salty Springs across all of these. We want, oh wait, let me pick a different one. Dusty Divot. Across all of these 5 rows, we want Dusty Divot to show up 5 times. We also want the pH values to be their own column as opposed to the pH description. And so it's just setting it up a little bit differently, because this means that we can then get Google Sheets or our other graphing programs to pull in the specific thing. If we want to graph pH, we can now graph pH from this setup of our database. We cannot from this setup of the data table. So thinking about how the data are organized, how we're actually putting them in, so that we're setting ourselves up for success, so that we can explore it and we can visualize it and we can look at what's going on in the data as we're trying to make sense of it. So when it comes to thinking about organizing data, do you go with a wide organization of a data table? Do you go with a long organization of your database? It really depends on what you want to do with the data. Where are you in the process of working with data? Because there's no one right way to organize data overall. But I will tell you that Google Sheets, as well as all the other graphing programs, expect a long organization. Does that mean long is right? No. But that means to actually leverage that tool and explore the data, it's going to go a lot easier for you if you have it in that long organization of the table, where every column is a variable, every row is an observation, and every cell has a value. And yes, there will be repetition, and that's okay. So typically, as we've said, data tables are good for collecting data, because we don't know how many observations we're going to make, so we don't know how many rows to make. And once we have found a relationship, because they are more concise, they take up less room on the page, that wide organization of the data table. Whereas our spreadsheets or our databases enable us to actually get into the data and explore around to find relationships, compare groups, explore variability, things that we were talking about on what are data, all those things that are there. Whew. Okay, so now let's pause and think about, so we've got our wide organization we often use in data tables to collect data, and once we've figured out what we want to say from the data, so the bookends of the process, we have our long organization that we often use with our databases as we're exploring, making sense, making meaning, making visualizations from our data. So a couple reflection questions before we wrap up. What is something that surprised you from this mini lecture? And what could a green light with organizing data be now that we've talked about this? What could be easier the next time you try to organize or graph data that you have? So pause the video, take a few moments to reflect on that. As always, thank you so much for all that you're doing and all that you will do for your learners coming forward when it comes to working with data. If you've got any questions or any requests for clarification, reach out via this contact information. Otherwise, have a fantastic day. Bye.